So last time we looked at different definitions of ecological restoration, emphasizing some of the important ideas such as a focus on restoring ecosystem structure and function, and a focus, as Don Falk put it, not on turning back the evolutionary clock, but to set it ticking again. We also looked at a short video on the diverse expertise of the U.S. Forest Service is bringing to bear on restoring the forests of California and the Pacific Southwest, which includes not only environmental scientists but social scientists, so that the service can effectively communicate with stakeholders in the communities that they serve. This is an important part of the process of ecological restoration, and one that we will continually come back to throughout the semester. What I want to do today is continue our introduction to ecological restoration and build off the focus of the land ethic and why we want to restore damaged or degraded ecosystems. Matt did an excellent job providing a great background of Aldo Leopold and his land ethic, which can serve as a great framework for thinking about why we do ecosystem restoration. I want to expand on that here today, first by revisiting the SER primer and examining the important characteristics or attributes of restored ecosystems, followed by sharing 3 different ways we can view restoration, and third, exploring how restoration can help our technological society connect back with nature. So let's review a little from last time. Remember that the Society for Ecological Restoration defines ecological restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of a damaged, degraded, or destroyed ecosystem. But what does that recovery actually look like? How do we go about quantifying ecosystem components to tell us whether our ecosystem restoration project has been successful? Well, according to SER, an ecosystem that is restored will contain sufficient biotic and abiotic resources to continue its development without further assistance or subsidy. This restored ecosystem will then demonstrate resilience to normal environmental stress and disturbance, and as a result will be linked with biotic and abiotic flows and cultural interactions. So in other words, it'll be integrated into its greater landscape. So as I mentioned, actually quantifying some of these metrics can be difficult as a restoration ecologist. But SER has tried to provide a list of 9 attributes that can help determine if a restoration project has been successful. And we'll be discussing many of these in greater detail over the semester, but I think it's a good idea to go over some of these now before we get too far into the semester, so that you have an idea of what a restored ecosystem should look like. So what are these attributes of restored ecosystems? Well, first, the restored ecosystem should contain a characteristic assemblage of the species that occur in a reference ecosystem and that provide appropriate community structure. So right there from off the bat, this definition or these attributes of restored ecosystems are going to require you to actually select a reference ecosystem that is going to provide the basis for you to compare whether your restored site has actually been restored. So there will be a suite of ecosystem structure, function, composition that will provide you with a guide to compare with your restored site. Second, SER says that the restored ecosystem should consist of indigenous species to the greatest practical extent. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have non-indigenous species. In some cultural ecosystems that have been restored, allowances can be made for exotic and domesticated species or for non-invasive rural species. So all of these are going to depend on what your specific objectives are that you define early in your restoration process. A third attribute of a restored ecosystem should be that all functional groups necessary for the continued development and or stability of that restored ecosystem are represented. And if not, the missing groups have the potential to colonize the restored area by natural means. So basically what we're looking for here is functional redundancy in terms of what species do. So for instance, there may be nitrogen fixing leguminous species. So having those species there and those functional groups, so that if one is locally extinct, or because of some type of disturbance becomes locally extinct or expirated, you can have another species that provides the same function in place. A fourth attribute deals with the physical environment. So the physical environment of the restored ecosystem should be capable of sustaining reproducing populations of the species necessary for the continued development and stability along the desired trajectory. Fifth, the restored ecosystem should function normally for its ecological stage of development, and signs of dysfunction should be absent. This is an important point, and something that we'll bring up later on in the semester, is that you are not trying to restore at all times to an old growth or some type of late successional community. Oftentimes, your restored ecosystem will be at the start of, say, a secondary successional process. And your goal as a restoration professional and a restoration ecologist is to put that ecosystem back on that developmental trajectory. Six, the restored ecosystem should be suitably integrated into the larger ecological matrix or landscape with which it interacts through abiotic and biotic flows and exchanges. This includes cultural aspects and human influences in the landscape. Seventh, potential threats to the health and integrity of the restored ecosystem from the surrounding landscape have been eliminated or reduced as much as possible. So basically, these exogenous disturbances that are not entirely natural are no longer going to impact the ecosystem that you have restored. Eighth, the restored ecosystem is sufficiently resilient to endure the normal periodic stress events in the local environment that serve to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem. So in some of the examples that Matt showed on the lecture on the land ethic from Eastern Washington in that sage steppe environment, restoring that landscape back to one where fire would be a critical ecosystem disturbance and the ability of that ecosystem to recover following fire at natural intervals would be an important characteristic or attribute for that specific ecosystem. And then finally, the restored ecosystem should be self-sustaining to the same degree as its reference system and has the potential to persist indefinitely under existing environmental conditions. So again, it's able to perpetuate itself, and you've basically put, as Don Falk mentioned from our previous lecture, you've put this ecosystem back on a natural developmental trajectory, and you're not trying to recreate something from the past, but you're trying to think about how this is going to develop into the future. The other thing that we need to keep in mind here with our definition of what ecological restoration is that ecological restoration is a process. Okay, and so while there are a variety of ways to approach ecological restoration, this slide represents a general process of ecosystem restoration that we'll come back to throughout the semester. And it's this process that will help us achieve and accomplish our goals as part of our restoration project. So let's take a quick, close look at this and dig down a little more into what it is that you're going to do when you develop a restoration plan. So the first thing you need to start with is with a clear, articulated, and defined purpose for your restoration project. This will either be defined by you or by your stakeholders and whomever you may be working for as part of your restoration project. And once that project purpose is clearly articulated and designed and developed, what you're going to need to do then is to look at your use policy documents. How can that land, how can that forest stand, how can that prairie, how can that farm field actually be utilized? What specific practices may be allowed or not allowed, depending on local zoning, for instance, or policy statements that are provided by the organization that you're working for. So you'll want to integrate those policy and limitations of use into your project purpose. And if there are some issues there, you may need to revise. This will also guide the specific master plan, that once you've defined these policies that are going to help set some boundaries as to how you develop that restoration master plan, you're then going to integrate with background information, so what you know of the specific ecosystem, that ecological knowledge that you bring to bear to the issue at hand. And then you're going to go out and you're going to inventory the site. You're going to have some information of what's there. You're going to evaluate the suitability of the site, its physical, biological, and cultural resources. What do you have there on site to work with? And that's going to help you develop that master plan within the context of what you know about the specific ecosystem you're working in and the use policies that you have in terms of your operational boundaries. And then from that, you'll also then develop some more specific project goals that relate more closely to the specific site at hand. You'll combine all of these together and develop a master plan, which will outlay your project vision, conceptual solutions to how you intend to solve the issues and the aspects of the ecosystem that need to be restored. And you'll see a dashed line leading back to your project goals here. At this stage, you may find that you need to redefine these project goals. And this is an iterative and continuing process as we develop a restoration plan. Once you have your master plan in place, you'll then start to look at specific sites within the tract of land that you're trying to restore or you're tasked with restoring. And from this, you'll develop some specific site objectives, location of restoration features, and develop a way and a plan to actually accomplish the specifics that you need to accomplish. In some ways, this may be that you have an area that contains a fire-dependent ecosystem. And in this case, you may need to think about a specific site plan where one of your objectives would be to restore fire back to that ecosystem. All right. What you may find, though, is that when you look at that specific objective, take prescribed burning as an example again, that it may not fit with the background. It may not fit with the current state of the ecosystem or the surrounding landscape because of cultural aspects that are part of your site inventory and analysis. There just may be too many people living nearby where it's actually, you can reduce the risk and be safe to actually use a prescribed burning plan. So at this case, you might come back and you may think, all right, well, maybe I need to reevaluate and revise that specific treatment or specific tool that I can use to restore the structure and function of that ecosystem. In that case, because I know I can't use fire, then maybe I want to use another technique such as mechanical removal or herbicides to emulate the outcomes of what a prescribed burn would do to that site. Over time, after we go through that iterative process of looking at specific site objectives and developing a specific site plan, at some point in time, we're then going to implement that plan. And once we implement that, we're going to want to have some specific guidelines for the people that are actually going to be out there doing the on-the-ground restoration. These are going to be some specific things like what is our planting rate? How many trees per acre are we going to plant? At what species are we going to plant? How are we going to prepare the site? Are we going to plant trees by hand, or can we get equipment in there to plant using some sort of mechanical device or implement to actually plant trees, just as an example. And then once we have our implementation done and we've actually gone through the first phase of actual on-the-ground restoration, there are three aspects that are going to be really critical to this. The first is research. So we're going to want to continually look and evaluate what's going on, which we're going to be doing through our monitoring phase, where we're documenting changes to the ecosystem and assessing how well we've achieved our goals. and the success of our different techniques, which then we can link with some adaptive restoration or experimentation, right, where we may try some different approaches, or we may tweak some of our planting, or go back in and do something else to tweak that we've realized through our monitoring of the ecosystem restoration project that we actually need to do something a little bit different. And we can use that from a self-learning research perspective. And then finally, we're going to have to directly manage this over time. We're going to direct the course of the restoration so that it continues to meet those restoration objectives. And oftentimes, it's at this last stage where we often fall short, or we'll find that restoration projects fall short. They get to this stage, money runs out, they move on to other things, people have a lot to do, they have a lot of areas that they need to restore and manage, and so they set this in process, they do the initial work, and then they walk away. And I think it's clear that we want to make sure that we're continuing to monitor, do adaptive restoration and adaptive research, and continue to manage this over time. So let's think about how we can specifically view restoration through some different lenses. Right, so we've kind of talked about this a little bit already. We're highlighting some of the ethical reasons why we might want to focus on ecosystem restoration. But we can look at our outcomes of restoration efforts through several different lenses or perspectives. And keep in mind that these are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, we could see that in most successful restoration projects, they may focus on some of all three of these different perspectives. And so the first, and probably the one that comes to mind most for everybody, is that we're looking at ecosystem or ecological restoration from this ecological perspective. Okay, and so this is what we think of why we're interested in restoration. There's something wrong with the ecosystem in terms of its structure and function, and we need to fix it. Right? And so we're approaching restoration as a way to initiate or accelerate ecosystem recovery. And there are a variety of different ways that we can use restoration, this initial activity that initiates or accelerates ecosystem recovery with respect to species composition, structure, and function. Okay, there are a variety of different ways and techniques to accomplish these goals. So for instance, we might be looking at using prescribed burning. Right? We may be in a fire-dependent system, and we need to foster the development of our target species. So what you have here is some work that we've been doing up in the northern lake states with mixed eastern white pine and red pine forests, where fire has been excluded for a long period of time, and we have a development, an understory development of dense vegetation that has accumulated over time that either impedes burning or, under the right conditions, can have these fires burning much hotter than they would have on the quote-unquote natural or pre-Euro-American landscape. And so one of the things that we can do is restore fire back into those ecosystems and look at burning off this understory or mechanically removing it and then burning if we're worried about high fuel loads. And that will help promote regeneration of the target species that we're interested in regenerating and getting into the canopy. In this case, red pine and eastern white pine. Okay, and some of these can be relatively hands-off. There are some ecosystems where we can just let natural ecosystem processes develop over time, especially if we're dealing with, say, shade-tolerant species. But then we may have other techniques that are going to be much more hands-on, okay, and they're going to be much more direct. So we can look at, say, stream restoration and riparian restoration, which may require significant ecological engineering, right, where we need to restore the hydrology and ecology of stream and riparian ecosystems, which may require constructing new channels like you see here, and modifying stream banks with riprap or rock to help prevent erosion as this develops over time. And what we hope happens is that we've created enough stability here with this heavy-handed engineering approach that over time those banks will become more and more stable, but then natural stream processes and meandering and the movement of sedimentation, okay, and the deposit of sedimentation as this stream starts to become back in equilibrium will take to place, but we need to give that a little bit of help, and we need to be hands-on or more hands-on at the very start. Okay, and I think it's important too to think that a lot of these ecological restoration techniques, things that we've been talking about here, may require constant attention, right? So if we're talking about invasive species removal, like these interns are doing, it's something that we may need to constantly monitor and then bring significant labor resources to control, all right? But we can also look at restoration not only from this ecological perspective, but we can look at it through a socioeconomic lens as well. And this is where we're looking at recovering flows of natural goods and services of economic consequence the functional ecosystems can provide for society. Okay, so in many cultural restoration projects, and there are many examples of this with tribal nations here in the United States and Canada, where there may be specific forest products or ecosystem products that these tribal nations have collected and utilized, and were natural goods and services that have been lost because of changes in how ecosystems have been managed. And as a result, we can look to new restoration projects that not only restore, say, the ecological processes and structure, but also are providing new or restoring those ecosystem services and natural goods. It could be water quality, it could be certain types of forest products that are non-traditional that can be collected and utilized. And so if we go back to the Great Lakes, the northern Lake States region, we have a lot of concern with emerald ash borer and its impact on black ash in swamp systems, in riparian systems in Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and northern Michigan, and parts of Ontario, because that black ash is a prime basket weaving material for a lot of the Chippewa tribal nations that are common in this region of the northern Lake States, right? And so that may be a cultural resource that has economic consequence that may be lost, and it's something that we may need to be thinking about in terms of how our restoration activities can help enhance. Okay, and what you'll often find is that if you can bring more of these different services to bear, not only kind of the provisioning service, all right, but also some of the other services that are going to be important to society as a whole, the more successful your restoration project will be, and the more buy-in you may have from a diverse group of stakeholders. And then finally, we can look at restoration through this third lens, if you will, which is looking at the personal and cultural value that our restoration activities provide. And so we can really think about how restoration can renew our relationship with nature in the realms of aesthetics, personal fulfillment, and shared experience and meaning. And this is an aspect of ecosystem restoration that's taken on much more light here in the recent past, of how we think about how we connect with nature and how our restoration activities can enhance not only the aesthetics of the landscape, but also the well-being of the landscape, which then kind of filters into helping to promote human health and societal health in terms of how our society operates. And so it's at this point, I'd like to end the lecture material for this time with an interview from Richard Louv, who's an author who's written several really good books that really document this disconnect that our society has developed with nature. And so in the mid-2000s, he developed this idea of nature deficit disorder, and he makes point to clarify that this is not a diagnosable disease, but something that he's come up through his observation, that we've basically disconnected our kids, and those kids are now having kids from nature, and as a result our society is having issues because of that. And then that technological emphasis that our society has can cause us to be disjointed with nature. Genetically, we're hardwired to evolve with nature, to be spending time in nature. The whole biophilia area of research and individuals such as E.O. Wilson have been talking about for the last 5 to 10 years really documents that our psyche as humans really is tied closely with nature. And so this may seem like an odd thing to bring up here in the restoration class, but I really do think that this is a part of this cultural aspect that we could start to look at restoration as being really important of. And this is something that if you listen to the author Richard Louv about how he thinks we can deal with solving this issue, you can pretty much plop restoration or ecological restoration right down in the middle of it as an important aspect of helping to solve this disconnect that we have with nature. But at the same time, it's a tool that you can use as you develop a restoration plan to try to think about that you have an objective of using your restoration activities to bring people closer to nature. So what I want to do now is have you listen to about a 10 to 11 minute interview with Richard Louv in a online interview that he did with an outfit a couple of years ago.
Disorder. This is a term that you have coined. What is it? Yeah. Well, first, it's not a known medical diagnosis, and I make that clear in both books. Maybe it should be, but it's not. What it is a handy way to describe what a lot of us have felt was going on for a long time, which is first the disconnection between children and nature, which is huge. I mean, this is what Bill McKibben calls one of the biggest, largest experiments in human history that we're doing with our kids now by basically pulling them out of nature for the most part. And there are implications for that. This is also true for adults increasingly. Some of the kids that I interviewed for Last Child in the Woods now are adults. They're young parents themselves. So this is going to have a profound impact on the human experience of just being alive. And we need to really think seriously about what kind of world we're going to get if that continues. Well, I think that nature deficit disorder and climate change are bookends, in a sense, of the same issue. They often also have approximately the same window of opportunity for us to do something about them. How many decades will go by where this disconnection between children and nature and now adults from nature continues before it's too late, before the culture loses its memory of a time when it was normal, considered normal for kids to go outside and just play in the woods, dig a hole, build a fort. We don't have a lot of time to fix that. Now, a lot of good things are happening, but at the same time, we have climate change. I'm ambivalent about how we think about climate change. On the one hand, it's a terrible thing that our pollution is speeding up that process. And we have to do whatever we can to slow that down, at least. That's true. But if we fill our kids and ourselves with fear, with that post-apocalyptic vision, we're not going to make much progress. Yes, the waters will rise, but we still have to live. So how can we live well? And I think that, associated with some of the ways of slowing down climate change are ways that we can live in a way that we are better than we are now. If we truly greened our cities, and I'm not just talking about solar panels, I'm talking about parks and green workplaces, and I don't mean saving energy, just that. I mean producing human energy by having more nature around us, which makes us happier and smarter and healthier. What if we did that? We have to stop talking as if the end of the world is near. We have to be careful how we talk to our kids about the future. When we start talking to them way too early, when they're very small, about climate change and all these terrible things that we do face, and we're talking to those kids about that, and they get that message from television, etc. In the exact same years in which they're not being allowed to go out and just play in nature just for the joy of it, then that sets them up to think of nature associated for the rest of their lives with fear and destruction. That's not doing them or the environment any favors. So we have to be careful about being overwhelmed by the negative environmental issues we do face. Another way to look at it is that because of climate change and pollution and these huge problems we face environmentally, everything in the next 40 years must change. We'll need new kinds of agriculture already beginning. We'll need new kinds of architecture and urban design already beginning. We'll need new kinds of energy, of course, already beginning. We'll need a new kind of civilization. Now, to any self-respecting, creative 16-year-old, that's good news if you frame it that way. And we need to begin to think about it in that way. Otherwise, we're just going to settle unconsciously for this post-apocalyptic vision. And is that what we're going to hand over to our kids and grandkids? That vision, or a different one? There's a great book people ought to read, which is Bringing Nature Home. And I quote the man who wrote it, Doug Ptolemy, quite a bit in that chapter. And he says that gardeners have enormous power right now that they don't recognize. That if we conserved every square inch of wilderness we've got today, and I hope we do, it won't be enough to provide the biodiversity or bring back the biodiversity that we need. If, however, we did that, plus we changed most of the yards in suburbia into native plants and to a different kind of botany, we could bring back butterfly migration routes by planting the right plants. We could bring back birds that have long since left our cities, certain species. Think how powerful families would feel, how powerful kids could feel if they thought that this plant that they're planting in their backyard, it's not just pretty, it's actually healing something huge, a butterfly migration route. I think that a good future is going to belong to the nature smart, people who really understand the transformative power of nature in our lives. Businesses that are truly nature smart will be more quote unquote sustainable. Teachers who understand the transformative power of nature, their students will do better. Schools that understand that, test scores will go up if they get those kids into nature more. That's what the studies are showing. Policymakers who understand that will be energized. They won't be saying the same thing over and over ad nauseum. They'll actually be talking about a different world that we could move to. This one, but it would look very different. Parents who understand the transformative power of nature, the restorative power of nature on their own children and themselves, those families will be happier and healthier. They'll bond more. I mean, that's one of the chapters in the Nature Principle is about family bonding and the impact of getting out into nature on literally the ability of a family to bond. There are 1,000 ways that we can become more nature smart, and we will have better lives and we'll build a better civilization if we do that. And I have great hopes that younger people in particular are going to understand this. I'm always struck by the young people who come up to me after speeches or raise their hand and say, I want to change my career. I want a career connecting people to nature. Where do I go to school? What careers can I have? I don't have great answers for them right now, but I deal with it to a degree in the book. And the look in their eyes and the look in people who are already doing this kind of work in their eyes is impressive. This is a look of joy in their eyes. This is happy work. Imagine that. Doing happy work that's associated with the future of the environment, the future of the human race.
What is your advice, last word you would like to audience to hear you?
I think that we need a new nature movement. I think environmentalism is in trouble in many ways. It's not convincing people anymore. And the people who lead the big environmental organizations know this. There are aging populations in the environmental groups. They're not getting the diversity that they're going to have in order to reflect America. But more important, they're not presenting a wonderful picture of the future that people want to go to. And they understand this. Sustainability alone is not sustainable. Simply talking about energy efficiency does not touch the heart in most people. Some people it does. But the idea of producing human energy through new kinds of cities, new kinds of schools, new kinds of workplaces, new kinds of homes, what we can do today in our home, that touches people. They want that. They're hungry for that. There are a number of other reasons that I think that we need what I call a new nature movement. But one of the most important reasons is that unless we do this, then the people who care about nature will lose ever more power, even more power than they're losing now. But there are these small movements out there, the food movement, the slow food movement, the biophilic design movement, the simplicity movement, the people who are the pediatricians who are now beginning to prescribe nature to kids and families, and this is happening. There are the environmental movement that still exists, which we have to, of course, respect and build as well. The sustainability movement through design and all that. The Children in Nature movement, which has brought all kinds of people together into the same room that don't want to be there in the same room usually, but they'll come together on that one. I think that that environmentalism now is a pup tent, and we need a big tent. And this big tent would have all of those movements and more underneath the roof of that tent. And that when we see all of that as one movement, then there will be enough power to create this civilization that I'm describing. One that our lives are as immersed in nature as they are in technology every day.
Thank you very much for your generosity
Good.
and your time in writing a great book.
Oh, thanks.